Hello, welcome to Experiencing the Revolution, Media as a Catalyst for Change. Thank you for joining me. What you just heard was a transition from the national anthem of Imperial Iran to the post-revolutionary anthem of the Islamic Republic. My name is Rain Udin and I'll be your host for this podcast. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan who is majoring in history. I'm currently taking the course Revolutionary Iran, taught by UM professor Catherine Babayan, who has authored several books on Persianate history. The multidimensional approach the course takes to understanding contemporary Iran is what inspired this podcast. This topic will be of interest to you if you want to learn about the events surrounding this widely publicized revolution, or if you have a general curiosity about how the media is utilized to awaken the revolutionary zeal of a nation. In today's world, we are routinely confronted with the power that social media platforms now have to make or break a revolution. But what is, or was, the role of traditional mass media in a revolution? And why is the Iranian Revolution exemplary of its efficiency to ignite socio-political change? The answer to this question lies in the conditions surrounding the revolution and its success. In December of 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini took the Shah's place as the highest authority in Iran and established the Islamic Republic of Iran after leading a successful revolt against the Pahlavi dynasty while in exile for 14 years. It's reasonable to assume that the deposition of the Shah would not have been feasible if it weren't for the massive following in Iran that Khomeini was able to establish. So, just how was Khomeini able to overcome censorship by the Shah's authoritarian regime and establish himself as a leader to Iranians while in exile for over 14 years before he came to power? In the book Small Media, Big Revolution, Communication Culture and the Iranian Revolution, co-authors Annabelle Shabrani Mohammadi and Ali Mohammadi provide us with a comprehensive analysis of mass media's role in the Iranian Revolution. A key aspect of this analysis is making the distinction between small media and big media. First, let us examine some forms of broadcasting, or big media, that existed in Pahlavi's Iran. The National Iranian Television was a relatively new state-run television channel which merged with Radio Iran in 1971 to form a public broadcasting monopoly directed by the Shah himself. Print media such as newspapers and postal service had long been established in Iran through British influence, but the rapid expansion of Pahlavi's broadcasting network surpassed the reach of print media. The large majority of state-controlled media broadcasted either select coverage of the Pahlavi regime or imported Western media. With this information, we can start to make some assumptions about the impact Pahlavi's selective output of Western media and news coverage might have had on its Iranian audience. The domination of this state-run broadcasting network is indicative of an attempt to limit coverage of the Pahlavi regime by relatively new forms of media. Censorship in Iran is often associated with criticism of the Islamic Republic's state-run media and its suppression of journalists. However, from the very beginning of the Pahlavi dynasty, suppression of the free press almost always coincided with policies aimed at modernization. Policies of reformation and legal restrictions on print media were legislated collectively. This was an attempt to censor the nation's large opposition to Western influence and Pahlavi's idealization of modernity. Censorship by the Pahlavi regime extended beyond the control it held over mass media in Iran. The Savak was the regime's intelligence agency, and it was established in 1957 with the help of the US CIA. It acted as a secret police that infiltrated and monitored the public sphere of Iran. While its presence restricted the ability of Iranians to mobilize against the Shah's dictatorship, it did not make it impossible. Most political parties and organizations were dissolved by the Shah, and his tactic of public surveillance hindered political mobilization. Yet the capacity that Iran's religious networks had to mobilize citizens was beyond the scope of both the Shah and the West. Religious spaces such as mosques were the only part of Iran's public sphere that enjoyed a sense of immunity from the censorship. Along with the traditional spaces that mosques provided for religious networking, there was another religious center which enjoyed slightly more freedom from the Shah's dictatorship. In the city of Qom, the Islamic clergy, or ulama, held powers that existed in a gray area of the Shah's dictatorship. They did this by maintaining a system of horizontal allegiance, which meant that a large fraction of Iranians remained loyal to the religious clergy rather than to the Shah. The distinct autonomy and large student population of Qom created a channel for ideas to be transported to and from Qom, as well as across cities of Iran. In response to the widespread censorship of media by the Shah, alternative methods of communication arose, later coined as small media. Cassette tapes of religious lectures became the only expression of political dissent to be freely distributed throughout Iran. Not only was the Shah aware of the drastic outcome that extending his authoritarian rule to Iran's religious networks would have, he was pressured by the U.S. to live up to his promises of reform. He instructed the Savak not to seize or destroy any copies of religious lectures. The copies of religious lectures, which were often diverse in their content, were immune from the Shah's censorship. Their presence in the market also provided a cover for the black market sale of cassette tapes. Audio recordings of revolutionary chants would soon be traded alongside religious lectures and music imported from the West. The protections that the religious networks had from the oppression of the Shah, as well as their influence on the public sphere, would give Khomeini the perfect conditions to spread his ideology. Now that we have a greater knowledge of the structure of media that existed in Pahlavi's Iran, let's further discuss the ways in which this structure enabled the successful revolution led by Khomeini. The sanctity of religious expression in Iran, which is relatively secured during the Shah's rule, was not lessened with the integration of political dissent. In fact, Khomeini's utilization of religious networks in Iran early on as a means to issue his criticisms of the Shah was initially met with enthusiasm from young religious scholars and some of the clergy. Prior to establishing his political career, Khomeini was an established lecturer and influential religious scholar. He continued his education and carried out lectures in Qom. The influence he established during his scholarly endeavors in Qom would manifest itself as political support before he was even exiled. In June of 1963, Khomeini gave a speech in Qom objecting to the Shah's white revolution and denouncing the regime. The Shah's reforms either reduced or removed entirely the power traditionally held by the Shia clergy. Khomeini's public declaration of dissent was unprecedented and resulted in his arrest 2 days later. Following his arrest, massive student protests broke out in Qom and Tehran, ending after 3 days in the deaths of students. This event is what distinguished Khomeini as an opposing political figure to the Shah. He was exiled from Iran a year later and eventually returned to Najaf, Iraq. This was an ideal place for Khomeini to settle, Najaf being a holy city of Shia Islam as well as another city in which he had already established his scholarly career. Khomeini was careful enough not to publicly criticize the Shah while in Najaf, but he would later give lectures on his vision of an Islamic government. His political theory, which was influenced by Shia Islam, Islamic philosophy, and history and mysticism, was appealing to Iranians who harbored resentment towards the Shah. The Pahlavi dynasty had exhausted itself with recurring efforts to model Iran after the West, and by flaunting its lavish monarchy. Meanwhile, Iranians faced increasing economic hardship and a threat to their cultural identity that was posed to them by their own government. It resulted in a collective abhorrence with the regime that Khomeini was all too familiar with. The scholar's tactical and charismatic lectures offered a resolution to this conflict, promoting an Islamic government that would instead value anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, martyrdom, and religious authority. To give you an idea of the charismatic nature of Khomeini, which complemented his utilization of the media to spread his ideas, here's a clip from one of his most famous speeches given after his return from exile. We don't have a translation, but try to focus on how Khomeini continuously seems to sway the crowd with his speech. As a religious and political leader, Khomeini was able to present his argument in favor of an Islamic government in a way that attracted support from Iran's Shia clergy as well as its citizenry. The well-established religious tourism between the cities of Najaf and Qom meant that the relatively autonomous religious networks of Iran could assist Khomeini in reaching his supporters without intervention from the Savak. Copies of the lectures on cassette tapes were produced en masse and smuggled into cities such as Tehran and Qom. The covert, widespread distribution of Khomeini's cassette tapes through Iran was influential enough to maintain his leadership role in Iranian politics even after 14 years in exile. The lectures were later published as the book Islamic Government, Governance of the Jurist. It was declared as Khomeini's most influential work, and its doctrine would later serve as the foundation for the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. These cassette tapes are what the book Small Media, Big Revolution is referring to. Khomeini didn't have the same tools to spread his ideas or crush his opposition as the Shah, but he had a strong connection with his audience that compensated for the little ability he had to reach them. Here's an example of the distinction between the two, which will put Khomeini's use of small media into perspective. In response to the rapid growth of both the Shah's opposition and of Khomeini's following, an article was published in the national newspaper on January 7, 1978, in an attempt to discredit Khomeini. It accused him of operating as a British Indian agent, conspiring to destabilize Iran in order to subjugate it to colonial rule. The outrageous accusation resulted in protests by students in Qom who clashed with police. Following this, Khomeini began leading the revolution from Najaf by pressuring mosques to commemorate the deaths of the students in the riots. As expected, on the day of the memorial services, demonstrations broke out across Iran. Khomeini began politicizing each and every casualty, promoting a culture that praises martyrdom. The publication of an article that was meant to demoralize Khomeini marked the beginning of the Iranian Revolution and only strengthened his support. Upon pressure placed upon Saddam Hussein in the Pahlavi dynasty, Khomeini was expelled from Najaf and arrived in France. The desired outcome of the Shah was that Khomeini would be obstructed from communicating with his followers. However, the advanced communication lines he could access in France had the opposite effect, and more copies of his lectures were smuggled into Iran at the peak of a revolution. In later demonstrations, Iranian citizens were marching in unity against the Shah, and several were toting large posters of Ayatollah Khomeini. His followers, most of whom had never made any direct contact with him, demanded that the Shah abdicate and Khomeini be allowed to return to Iran. The case of Ayatollah Khomeini shows the capacity of the media to enable a religious scholar who had been in exile for 14 years to be held to a higher esteem than any member of the influential religious clergy that had actually lived through the revolution alongside Iranians. Now we have a structured image of the events that allowed for the revolution's success. Let's recap the ways in which the media acted as a vessel for these outcomes. The Shah responded to frustrated Iranians by censoring them, further exemplifying his disregard for his own people and forcing them to form underground media outlets in order to express their political dissent and opposition to westernization. Iran's religious network's position as the only part of the public sphere free from the Shah's censorship and surveillance provided favorable conditions to give Khomeini success in building his political career while in exile. The White Revolution carried out by the Shah in the 60s is often considered the beginning of the end to his reign. His policies of modernization weakened the religious clergy, who maintained the responsibility of resolving the ideological differences between the regime and its rural population, as well as its religious scholars, who held a horizontal allegiance to the authority of the clergy. This social conflict furthered the student support of Khomeini when he publicly denounced the Shah's reforms. Moreover, the Shah's practice of appealing to the West at the expense of Iranians is what fueled the citizenry to support Khomeini. Any spiritual leader with a strong connection to the Islamic identity and authority of contemporary Iran, who promoted an ideology which was the antithesis to that of the Shah's, was at a political advantage. Khomeini's status in Iran as an influential religious leader was the foundation of his ability to utilize small media to maintain support while in exile. The Pahlavi regime's preemptive attempt to discredit Khomeini triggered the onset of the revolution that would later force him to abdicate. The public outcry it caused inspired Khomeini's supporters and the rest of the nation's political dissenters to unify under the common goal of removing the Shah. Khomeini's active leadership in the revolution, along with the Shah's increasingly passive approach, granted him the opportunity to seize power after the Shah abdicated and swiftly implement the Islamic Republic of Iran. We can see how small media was Khomeini's only real tool available to organize politically and establish himself while in exile. Cassette tapes were a necessity for him to make use of the connections he had established in the religious and academic communities of Iran, which served to assist him in distributing the tapes. Considering this, along with the Shah's counteractive use of big media to discredit Khomeini, it gives us an idea of the lessons the Ayatollah learned about the power of the media. His success being enabled by it undoubtedly made him aware of the power it had to thwart his own agenda. This information will be a good reference to understand the Islamic Republic's motivations and their tactical censorship of the media. It raises questions on the viability of the new regime escalating Iran's censorship. If the media's catalytic effect led to the Shah's downfall, could these same tactics of censorship disenchant Iranians who would have otherwise been supportive of the new regime? Now we have a few things to consider when we hear concerns about censorship in the Islamic Republic. If you want to gain more insight into how modern-day mass media operates within Iran, check out Annabelle Serbrani's book, Blogistan, The Internet and Politics in Iran. It analyzes the role that the internet has to play in mobilizing Iranians and channeling their political frustrations today. I hope the insight gained in this podcast will encourage you to reflect deeper on the ability that the media has to ignite similar socio-political change across time and space. Thank you for listening.